Welcome to The Cow Behind the Barn, a podcast exploring humanity, the world, and the divine as experienced and interpreted by an artist. I'm Kevin Caldwell, a co-founder of the Table Collective. In past episodes, I've been exploring ways of seeing the mysterious nature of this world through the windows of quantum physics, the Gita, Buddha, and Lao Tzu. And several questions keep emerging. Is the stuff the world is made of eternal? Are there multiple worlds? How does quantum entanglement affect everything? And does that entanglement include something more than our own consciousness? I can't help but bring those questions into this episode as I ask about the nature of the world according to Genesis and John. Two more windows into the mystery of the world that is our where. All these texts invite us to open ourselves to more than just theoretical reflection. We're invited to imagine and to feel as we read or hear. So as I did in the last episode, I want to begin this one using music to set a receptive atmosphere. And if the music sounds familiar that I'm about to play, that's because I use it in the intro and the outro music for the podcast. I'm offering it here as an invitation to be receptive and attentive as we begin. It's a rough recording of 4 movements for piano. Now to Genesis and John. But wait, I had said that I would be exploring Judeo-Christian Islamic ways of understanding the nature of the universe as we know it. And what happened to that Islamic viewpoint? With every episode, I continue to discover the path as I'm making it. And as I got into this one, I realized there's just too much to do all three together. To be honest, I felt exactly the same about the Gita, Buddha, and Lao Tzu. But I didn't allow myself the freedom then to adjust, and I wish I had. At any rate, I decided to follow the path as it emerges this time, and the Quran will come in the next episode. Genesis and John will be my windows into the Jewish and Christian ways of seeing the world. In the book of Genesis, or Bereshith in Hebrew, there are actually 2 creation accounts in there, and here's the opening verses of each of them. So first, the opening verses of chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." There was light, and God saw that the light was good. And then the second account begins in verse 4 of chapter 2. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the heavens and the earth. Now, what do these passages reveal about the world, the where that we inhabit? I want to hear first, actually, from rabbinic voices. And so here's a quote from the chapters of Rabbi Eliezer. And it's this: "The Holy One, blessed be He, alone existed before the heavens and the earth. There were no angels or spirits, no pre-existing material from which the heavens and the earth were fashioned. Since time is measured by the motion of the planets, time did not exist prior to their creation. Before creation, there was only the Holy One and His name." Another rabbi, Moses ben Nahman, also known as Ramban, believed that God created the heavens and the earth from nothing as two different substances, from which everything else was then formed. And Genesis 2 speaks of the account of the generations of the heaven and the earth. Generations comes from a word meaning to beget or to give birth, and an account of generations is a genealogy. Thus, Genesis 2 is the genealogy of the ancestral lines, we might say, of the heavens and the earth. In part, suggested by the word generations, and in part by mention of plural heavens, some of the more mystical traditions of interpretation in Jewish religious history suggest that there have been other worlds, perhaps thousands of them, which may have passed away before this one or might still be in existence. Now, as I turn my own reflections to the text of Genesis, I will keep all those prior points in mind, as well as the questions from the prior episodes. Is the world eternal, made from something eternal? Is the universe all there is? And what about entanglement? So, some key terms in this opening to Genesis. In the beginning, God made. Now, this has normally been taken to mean that there was nothing prior to the heavens and the earth, and also that this is the only heavens and earth. But does the text actually require that interpretation? The Hebrew word rendered created, in the beginning God created, suggests the act of forming or carving or shaping, which could imply that there was something prior to cut from and to shape with. What about heavens and earth? The earth is actually described by two words. It's formless and it's void. Vast, chaotic, futile, useless, empty, nothingness. More about the heavens will come later. I'm going to move on to other key words. There's darkness on the face of the deeps, an abyss in the Greek version of this passage. And there was a wind of God, or Spirit of God, that was hovering on the face of the waters. This is all actually incredibly mysterious. There's land and there's water mentioned, but so far nothing's been done to actually separate them from each other. So where are they? How are we to imagine this scene? There's heavens or skies and there's wind, but actually the atmosphere hasn't been formed yet. That shows up later. And it shows up as something that gets inserted like a bubble in between waters above and waters below. But none of that is there yet. So the waters and the land and the heavens are all amorphous, indistinguishable, and yet there are waters and deeps which were already described as having a face or a surface, implying features, distinctions. It's as if the earth and the sky exist but are not yet formed, as if they're still in embryo, as it were. And this idea of an embryo is actually not that far-fetched. When the text says the wind of God, or Spirit of God, was hovering over the deeps, the word for hover can refer to a bird sitting on her nest of eggs to hatch them. Elsewhere, the Jewish scriptures actually make an even more explicit reference to a divine role in bringing the world to birth, or hatching it, so to speak. Psalm 90, verse 2 says, before the mountains were brought forth. And the Hebrew word for brought forth is often used for women in labor. The psalm continues by saying that the world came into existence. But the word there is the word for begotten. The world was begotten and brought forth like a woman in labor. Well, back to Genesis. What is it, though, that is doing the hatching? I've referred to the wind of God or Spirit of God a couple of times. And wind of God in some of the translations can mean God's breath or a strong wind. But most understand this to refer to the divine Spirit, hovering, nurturing the distinct elements of the world into existence. Recounted a few verses later, all those elements include land and water, plant life, animals, fish, birds, darkness, light. And speaking of light, this is another mysterious element, because when first mentioned, let there be light, it comes into being before there's anything visible, anything that can enable the visibility of this light, like the sun or the moon. It just is. Some of the rabbis say that in the beginning, light filled the universe from one end of it to the other, and that when the sun and moon came into being, the primordial light was actually sown into all creation. The rabbinic understanding that the primordial light in Genesis might have been sown into creation comes the closest, I think, to how, inspired by theories of quantum entanglement, I've described the world. Light also features significantly in John, so I'll come back to Genesis after I look there. Just as I began with rabbinic ideas before looking at the text of Genesis itself, I will briefly look at what some early Christian thinkers had to say about the nature of the world before directly exploring the book of John. Early Christian writers were greatly shaped by the philosophers Plato and Aristotle, and as such generally rejected the idea of multiple universes based on the idea from those philosophers that a single universe would be more perfect. Now, as to whether the world came from nothing or was formed from pre-existing eternal stuff, things are a little less clear. Two of the earliest Christian thinkers, after the period of those who had known Jesus in person, seem to suggest that matter pre-existed God's creation of the world as we know it. So Justin Martyr, somewhere in the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era, said this: God, having altered matter, which was shapeless, made the world out of, quote, a substance, Justin, quote, end quote, Justin says, had been referred to by Moses. And then Clement of Alexandria, late 2nd century Common Era, early part of the 3rd. God made the world from the shapeless mass of matter. However, the idea that the world came out of nothing, ex nihilo, became dominant by the end of the 3rd century of the Common Era and has remained the dominant view of Christian theology ever since. Well, what would John say about all this? Before I dig in there, I want to address two questions about John. First, why am I using John? Well, there are other New Testament texts I could use, but it's clear to me that at the beginning of his book that we call the Gospel of John, John is writing with Genesis in mind. And his views differ from those of Genesis at several points. So it seems natural for me to use John after the Genesis material. And second, can I really say that John is Christian? Does he represent the Christian view of these things? John's religious heritage was actually the Jewish religion. But by the time he writes, a separation was taking place between followers of the Jewish rabbi Jesus and a majority of the Jewish leaders. It was not yet a division between what we know of as Judaism and Christianity, for Christianity as a religion had not yet come into existence. That happened over time, and sadly, really grieves me to say, it was accompanied by tremendous anti-Semitism. John's writings, however, were part of the soil from which the Christian view of the nature of the world would be formed, and so it seems fitting to use it here. Keeping all of that in mind is why I've focused on John, and I want to let John speak. And I'm going to do so using my own translation. In the beginning, the Word was. Now, what does he mean by the Word? There are many proposed sources for John's ideas, especially about the word here. Stoicism, philosopher named Philo, ideas about wisdom in the Jewish scriptures. I'm not convinced that John drew from any single source. I think he was intentionally and also at times subconsciously navigating within the larger cognitive environment, so to speak, of his place and time. I'll try to let the text bring out the way that John understands the word, so stay tuned. The passage continues. In the beginning, the Word was toward God, and God was the Word, which was towards God. This phrase in Greek forms something like a loop, as I read it, that circles back on itself to repeat. The Word was toward God, and God was the Word, which was towards God. And God was that Word, which was towards God. And God was that Word, which was towards God, and so on. So the Word and the divine here, in John's view, are profoundly connected, entwined, entangled, I think inextricably. But this is merging into the lane that I've called consciousness and the nature of the divine self, if you will, and I need to return to that later. So some other key terms. There's the words "in the beginning," with which John opens his text in the same way as the Greek version of Genesis does. And then back to that word, word. As I mentioned, it's common for Christians to link word here with the personification of wisdom, spoken of, for example, in the 8th chapter of the book of Proverbs in the Jewish scriptures. But that figure, if we read it closely, was clearly a created entity. Wisdom was created when God made the world. The rabbis also see it that way. Some Christians have suggested that this is the word by which God creates, when later in Genesis God says, "Let there be." However, John is saying that the word never had a beginning, whereas an act of speech, I might say, is something that begins and ends, like "let there be." Well, so let me think a little more about that fact that the word was and didn't come into being. The word did not become. There was a Greek word for that, is a Greek word for that, and John uses it later for other concepts and things in this same passage, things that come to be, but he doesn't use it here. Here the word simply was. It did not come to be. It was not made. And then the next sentence in John. All things came to be through that word, and apart from that word, not one single thing came to be. Everything became, there's that word, through the word, which is the word that is towards God, which is the word that is towards God, which is the word that is towards God. So everything came to be through the divine. And then, in that word was life. Again, life did not come to be. Life, like the word, and like God in John, simply was. It existed, and it existed in the Word, which is God, which is the Word, which is God. The word life is not in Genesis. Light is, however, and John includes that term as well and connects it with life, so I want to turn to that. This life, John says, was the light of all humanity, and the light is shining in the darkness, and the darkness has not extinguished or overwhelmed that light. A few verses later, John is going to add that the true light, the real light, the essential light, which continually shines and illumines all human beings, was coming into the world. That light was always in the world, but could also continue to come into it. This is actually close to the rabbinic idea of light being sown into all creation. But in John, that light is in the life, which is in the Word, which is divine, and through which all things came to be. Life and light and the divine are all entangled with all of creation in John in a more explicit way than we see in Genesis. Well, how might Genesis and John address the sorts of questions which surfaced from the Gita and Buddha and Lao Tzu and quantum physics? Was the world created from nothing? There's actually no explicit answer to that question in the texts, even though both Jewish and Christian heritages have tended to say creation was from nothing. Is there just one world? Again, it's not a question that these texts were asking, and so they don't answer it. What about the entanglement that I've been exploring? In Genesis, the created world is in some way other than the creator, though there are streams, as we've seen in the Jewish scriptures, which speak of creation being begotten. And also, a fact that I didn't look at earlier, but is true elsewhere in the Jewish scriptures, that God at some points is depicted as wearing the created world like clothing, which is very similar to what we actually saw in the episode when we looked at the Bhagavad Gita. In John, the life which came to be as a result of the creative activity of the divine is in the divine being. Life is in him. And these could be seen as ways of describing what quantum physics terms entanglement, at least as I've been trying to understand it. Light deserves special mention. In Genesis, there's a primordial light, which, as we saw, some rabbis say refers to the light infused into all creation. In John, the light illumines everyone in the world, though for John that light comes from life, whereas, as we've seen in the Jewish scriptures, it's light that leads to life. And I say that light needs special mention because we're going to see that light is a very important theme as well in the Quran and in Islamic understandings of the nature of the world. Well, before comparing the Gita and Buddha and Lao Tzu with Genesis and John, which I'm very tempted to begin to do right away, I still do want to bring the Quran into the conversation in the next episode. And after that, I'll present a comparative conversation, as it were, among all those heritages. And then I plan to develop an episode with more about quantum physics, looking back at all of these, and conclude with my own attempt at a synthesis of it all, using an approach that I've called mutualism, seeking to let each voice speak, seeking to learn from each about this world that is our where. And for me, this entire process of exploring religious heritages and quantum physics continues to add layers upon layers of mystery, and for me, wonder. So it seems fitting to return to how I began the episode, with a reminder to us to be receptive, welcoming, and open, a reminder to pay attention to and to see this world that is our where, in which it seems we are so mysteriously entangled. So I close with replaying the musical piece we began with, 4 movements for piano. thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time for more about this mysterious world that is our where. Until then.